The thing that won't leave me alone is a square of wood no bigger than a breadboard tucked flush into a polished floor. You wouldn't notice it unless you knew where to press your palm on a faint seam, your weight shifting until the plank coughs, the ring bolts whisper, and the dark below answers back with the damp breath of earth. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. I come from the kind of family that keeps the porch light on whether you're expected or not. I grew up under that soft halo, June bugs tapping the glass, cicadas working the dark like a choir, believing that as long as there was a light, people found their way. By the time I turned 48, I'd traded childhood summers for midnight shifts, patching up strangers in a Detroit trauma unit, learning which silences meant suffering and which meant shock. On my days off, I drove the same neighborhood loop I'd always driven, bakery on the corner where they still fold your change into your palm, a laundromat that smells like warm cotton, thrift stores where the old men argue baseball as though the box scores might change if they yell loud enough. Routine kept the edges sanded. It gave me something to hold when my hands weren't steady. Harper never did like routine. My kid sister could make a plan out of a Post-it and a smile, then change both before lunch. She was the kind who kept a small camera in her bag even on errands in case the light did something interesting against a brick wall. I called her Redbird when she wore that faded denim jacket with the little red stitching along the collar. She called me Evie when she wanted me to stop lecturing and start listening. We were our own weather me, the steady barometer, her the pleasant wind that could turn on a dime. She met Ryan in a grocery store parking lot, and yes, I rolled my eyes at that, and yes, it stuck anyway. He was a project manager at a small design firm, the sort of man who thinks about backup plans before anyone else has thought to put gas in the tank. Quiet smile, good shoulders, a habit of checking that everyone had a chair before he sat down himself. The first time I watched him with Harper, he held her laughter the way some men carry a fragile box, two hands balanced, careful not to jar. When they told me about a 2-week honeymoon with part of it in Montana, a cabin way out, no interruptions, no phones, I said what older sisters say. Be smart. Let me know where you're staying. Send a photo so I can prove you're still real people and not two names caught in a digital loop. Moss Hollow shows up on maps like a smudge. You get there by leaving other places first. Out past the farm stands and the carved bears clustered outside roadside shops. The land pulls itself into tall dark green and asks you to lower your voice. The county road narrows to one lane in long stretches. Potholes open like little mouths. Dust comes to rest on your hood and stays. In summer, the air is dry enough that pine needles hold their shape under your boots instead of smearing into a carpet. Evenings cool quick, 85 in the afternoon, 55 by the time the stars lay down thick across the sky. If you stand still long enough, your breath becomes a kind of metronome for the forest, slow and precise, and you start to understand how sound carries differently in deep trees. I learned that country as a girl on camping trips, my dad showing us the right way to hang a line between two trees without tearing the bark. My mom pretending not to worry when we went to fetch water alone. We were a 2-tent family until the summer the zipper stuck and turned us into one, my dad swearing under his breath at a stubborn tooth. That was the last time we all slept outdoors together. After that, the porch light and the moths were enough wilderness for them. Harper liked the idea of a way. She liked that word so much she said it twice when she told me. Away, away, she said over coffee, her ankle bouncing against the table leg. Past the places where folks go to be seen. Dad would hate it. She laughed when she said that, but her eyes dipped just a little toward the spoon in her cup. We knew by then that Dad had gotten real good at being present for pictures, but not for the parts in between. Families carry their own weather, too. Sometimes you drive across state lines and it still rains the same. Ryan booked the place online. The pictures made it look like one of those cabins that calendar companies print for January green. Roof broad porch, a railing sturdy enough for a line of wet towels. A place that said, "Come settle down." We kept the world off the steps. I looked at the listing the way I look at x-rays, slow twice over, Then once again, not for the big fractures, but for the hairline trouble you'll miss if you're tired. Kitchens tell you things. This one was stainless and spotless, not a nick or a scorch mark anywhere. The beds looked sharp enough to cut you just by lying down wrong. There was a pleasant sheen in every photo and no fingerprints on the glass. It didn't strike me then, not like it does now, how a space can be scrubbed to the point of vanishing. I was just glad they could afford something neat after paying for a wedding on the far side of reasonable. We had their send-off in my apartment, cold fried chicken white cake wedding cards propped up where houseplants should have been. My neighbor, Mrs. Copeland, brought over iced tea in a glass pitcher and cried twice without apologizing. The last thing I did was slip a little first aid kit into Harper's duffel. She made a face and then kissed my cheek. "You're my favorite," she said the way she said it when we were 10, and I let her cheat off my spelling list. Ryan promised again to text the reservation details and their route. He promised because he's the kind of man who doesn't mind promising. Some folks feel caged by timelines and check-ins. He treated them like handrails on a steep stair. The night before they left, I had what my mother would call a restless house. I couldn't get the air right. My shoulders remembered the weight of the emergency bag I'd worn for years at the hospital, the one that digs a permanent groove into your back even after you stop carrying it. I washed my hands without needing to twice. I took the trash out at 11, then again at midnight when I realized I'd set the wrong bag by the door. On the way back upstairs, I met myself on the landing, not in any mystical way, just in the mirror there, and saw that I'd been holding my breath. I let it out. I told myself it was the shift work catching up to me. I told myself I'd sleep once I heard their engine turn over and fade into the distance, once I knew the porch light had done its job and the road was doing the rest. They left at 9 in the morning because Ryan wanted to miss the worst of the city traffic. He texted at a gas station outside Kalamazoo Coffee for the driver powdered donuts for the bride. He sent a picture of Harper making a face with sugar on her lip, her hair pulled back under a ball cap that used to be mine. They turned west and the sky opened and flattened the way it does over the plains. I kept working. I bandaged a boy who'd tried to trim his hedges with a borrowed chainsaw. I sat with a woman whose breath went wrong and waited for her numbers to settle into the range that would let her go home. Shift work makes you a student of beeps and blinks of what counts as crisis and what passes for it. The hours moved like thick water. I checked my phone in the locker room at every break because even grown sisters do that when babies become brides and head out toward a place that calls itself hollow. They reached Billings the next day and bought groceries under the strip mall lights. Harper sent a shot of a flimsy cake with pink frosting that said, "Just married," in letters so anxious they looked like they might run off the edge of the box. Ryan texted, 2 more hours tomorrow, then we check in. He added the address like a small prayer Moss Hollow trail. Elevation roughly 400 feet. High of 78 degree F, low in the 50s. He always did throw numbers at uncertainty. It's not a bad habit, it's just not always enough. In the days when my mother's hands were still steady, she used to put up peach preserves and write the date on the lids with a marker that bled through to her fingers. The summer smell of those jars could make a hard day bearable. Sometimes in the middle of a 12-hour shift, I'd think of that slow, sure work. The way you boil the air out of a jar so what's good inside can last, and I'd breathe easier. I remember thinking about peaches while I picked up a few extra supplies for my own house that week. Batteries, bottled water, the plain bar soap Harper likes when she stays over. That's the sort of thought you file under nothing until later, when small things get promoted to clues and you build a map out of habits. I spoke to Harper on the morning they aimed the nose of the Jeep toward the mountains. She had the window down. I could hear wind and a country station doing the weather at the top of the hour. She said the sky looked like it had been washed. She said Ryan had found a station that played old gospel on Sundays, even if it was Wednesday. She told me not to fuss, which is how she says she loves me when she's got something she wants to do her way. I told her to check the tap water when they got there to let it run a minute in case the lines hadn't been used in a while. Nurse advice, common sense pretending to be expertise. Moss Hollow is not a town you drive through to reach another town. It's the end of the sentence. The rental directions warned about the last half-mile slow-going ruts deeper than they look. Watch for wildlife at dusk. Harper texted a photo from the trailhead sign anyway, just to show me they'd made it as far as people make it before they are strictly alone. The photo came in choppy, like a television with the antenna knocked sideways, green roof peeking through pines, a porch rail that looked thick as a fence post, a picnic table scarred with initials. Under that, her message, safe, smells like the forest after rain. I wrote back 3 words. Send more later, and she tapped back a little heart. My phone made the tiny chime it makes when a thing lands where it should. That afternoon, I cleaned my kitchen the way I do when I need to feel useful about matters I can't touch. The sun slanted across the counter and turned a line of water into a silver thread. I wiped until the cloth made that clean squeak you get on glass. I heated a bowl of soup I didn't want and stood by the sink to eat it because I didn't plan to sit long. There's a particular quiet that falls in a house where you live alone, the kind with good manners that waits its turn and doesn't interrupt. I set my phone where I could see it from anywhere in the room. Around 8, I stepped out to my own porch and switched on the light. It glowed the way it always had, filling the space between the steps and the sidewalk with something soft you could trust from a distance. A neighbor's dog huffed twice and decided to lie back down. Somewhere up the block, a screen door sighed against its frame. I watched the moths do their jittery dance, tapping the glass with their soft bodies, falling away, returning again, small, faithful motions. By 9:30, the sun would have been gone behind those Montana trees, and cool air would have started to slide off the hills like a sheet. I pictured Harper kicking off her shoes and Ryan pouring 2 fingers from the bottle they saved for the first night. I pictured a fire built small and tidy because that's the way he did everything. The image felt steady enough to hold while I rinsed my spoon and set it in the rack. I dried my hands. I told myself they were just getting settled, that the world is not obligated to deliver every update on schedule. I left my phone face up on the table and turned off the kitchen light. The porch glowed on a little lighthouse for an empty street. I think that was the first night I noticed how long a house can hum to itself after you've stopped moving, how the refrigerator and the clock decide to take their turn speaking. The minutes added themselves together without making a sound. A text draft waited on my screen. Send a quick arrival picture when you have it. I didn't hit send. I wanted to give them room. The porch stayed lit longer than I meant it to. I stood there in the doorway with my hand on the switch and watched the circle of warm light touch the top step, and stop there polite as always, refusing to reach any farther than it should. I listened just in case the night had something to say. And when nothing did, I left the light on and went back inside, telling myself I'd turn it off when my phone finally chimed. The morning after I left the porch light on the air had that strange stillness that feels like something holding its breath. I made coffee, checked my phone, nothing. The last message from Harper was the one from the trailhead safe. I told myself the mountains probably swallowed their signal that the first day in any new place takes time to settle. I tried to picture her and Ryan unpacking, finding their rhythm in that cabin surrounded by pine and shadow. But sometime around noon, a small pulse of unease began to build, the kind that has no reason you can point to, just a low hum under the ribs that tells you something's gone sideways. It was subtle at first, a thought I kept pushing away. Maybe they slept late. Maybe they drove into town. Maybe they were too happy to check in. I tried all the maybes like I was trying on coats, and none of them fit. By late afternoon, I started calling. It rang once, twice, then went straight to voicemail. I left a quick message. Just checking in, call when you can. Then another. A few hours later, softer, but tighter around the edges. I knew her battery might have died. I knew service could vanish in a heartbeat up there. Still, every time I hung up, the silence grew heavier as if the line itself were closing off inch by inch. That evening I walked down to the mailbox and back just to see other houses lit from within curtains-drawn televisions flickering. Life went on the way it does, unaware that in some corner of the map, a clock had quietly stopped. The next morning I called the rental company, the one that managed Moss Hollow. A woman answered, cheerful voice, quick to reassure. She told me everything was fine, the walkers had checked in on schedule, and no complaints had been filed. I asked if she could reach them, maybe through the property owner. She hesitated just long enough to let me know she'd stepped off the script. The owner handles guest privacy personally, she said, meaning she wouldn't say his name. I thanked her anyway, hung up, and opened my laptop. It took less than 10 minutes of digging through online listings to find the cabin again. The owner was a man named Don Blandon, mid-50s address listed somewhere along the same road. His photo looked like the kind of man who could fix a fence post without being asked sun-worn face squint that might have been a smile if you wanted to believe it. By the third day, I called the county sheriff's office. I told the dispatcher that my sister and her husband were missing. She asked when I'd last heard from them, what vehicle they were driving, if they had any medical issues. The questions came in a steady rhythm, professional and practiced. I could hear keys clacking in the background. When she asked if I was sure they were missing, I said yes. I said I knew my sister's patterns and something wasn't right. She promised to send someone to check the property. I waited by the phone for the rest of the day, walking from room to room, because sitting made the silence louder. That night a deputy called. His voice was kind, heavy with the tone lawmen use when they're delivering something unfinished. They'd gone to the cabin. The Jeep was still there, locked keys inside on the counter. The beds were made. The kitchen was spotless. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing broken. It's like they packed up and walked off, he said. Maybe they went hiking, got turned around. I asked if they'd searched the woods. He said they were organizing a volunteer team and the owner, Mr. Blandon, had given them access. The way he said the owner's name told me it was already familiar to him. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table and listened to the hum of the refrigerator, the one noise that reminded me I was still in a living house. Around 2 a.m, I started making lists, things to pack, people to call, what to do when I got there. The next day I told my supervisor I needed time off. She didn't argue. Nurses recognized the look of someone on the edge of bad news. The flight to Montana was quiet, half empty, the way midweek flights sometimes are. Out the window, the landscape changed from city grid to endless green mountain spines rising like frozen waves. When I landed, the air felt different, cleaner, but thinner, as if it came at a price. I rented a truck and started the long drive north, following the directions the sheriff's office had emailed me. The road narrowed mile by mile until the asphalt gave up and turned to dirt. Potholes kicked dust against the windshield. By the time I saw the sign for Moss Hollow Trail, the sun was low, and the trees leaned close, swallowing the light. The first thing I noticed when I stepped out was the smell, pine, cold earth, and something else underneath, faint but sharp like bleach cut with rainwater. The cabin stood just ahead, perfect as a postcard green roof wraparound porch, not a window cracked or smudged. There was yellow tape across the doorframe, fluttering weakly in the breeze. I ducked under it, careful not to touch anything. Inside, it looked more like a display home than a place where people had lived. Everything too arranged, too deliberate. A single glass sat upside down in the sink, spotless. The bedspread lay smooth and flat, corners tucked tight enough to bounce a coin. I had seen death cleaned up before, but never life erased this precisely. I found Sheriff Halbrook out back near the tree-lined cigarette behind his ear clipboard in hand. He greeted me with that blend of politeness and discomfort reserved for relatives of the missing. I told him who I was. He nodded, said he'd heard from me already. They were running dogs, he explained, grid-searching the area in teams. I asked if they'd found anything, footprints, torn fabric, signs of wildlife. He shook his head. Nothing so far. His eyes drifted toward the trees where volunteers in orange vests moved slowly between trunks. The forest swallowed their voices. He led me back to the porch and told me about the timeline as best they could piece it together. The couple checked in late afternoon left no message or note. The owner hadn't come by until days later, said he noticed the door unlocked and called it in. There was no forced entry, no blood. He spoke like a man reading a case file he'd already decided was unsolvable. I asked about the bleach smell. He frowned slightly, said the cleanup crew might have used disinfectant during the search. When I told him I'd worked enough scenes to know the difference between cleaning and covering, he didn't argue. He just looked away and said they were doing all they could. I walked the perimeter after he left. The ground behind the cabin sloped into a narrow drainage filled with stones slick from rain. The grass was trampled in places, but not enough to mean struggle, just foot traffic, maybe searchers, maybe before. The woods beyond were thick, a wall of green and gray trunks closing in tight. The silence there wasn't peace, it was pressure. Every snap of a twig echoed too long. I took a few steps in and stopped. It was easy to see how a person could vanish here, how sound itself could be swallowed. Back inside, I noticed something odd near the fireplace. The grout between the hearthstones was darker in one spot, a smudge that didn't quite match the rest. I knelt down and touched it. The surface felt slightly sticky even after all the cleaning. My fingertips came away with a faint reddish tint that looked brown in the lamplight. I said nothing to anyone about it. I just made a note in my phone and wiped my hand on a tissue I'd brought in my pocket. That night I stayed at a small motel in town, the kind with buzzing neon and towels rough from too many wash cycles. I kept the curtains half open, the light from the parking lot cutting a pale stripe across the bed. I replayed every conversation with Harper from the weeks before her laugh over coffee, her voice in that last call, the sound of wind behind her words. I tried to find something I'd missed, a warning she might have hidden even from herself. Around midnight, I thought I heard a knock, soft and deliberate, but when I checked the door, it was only the ice machine sputtering down the hall. I sat back on the bed and stared at my packed duffel. Inside was the little first aid kit I'd given her before the trip. I didn't even remember packing a second one for myself, but there it was. That small coincidence twisted something in me I didn't have words for. The next morning I went back to the sheriff's office to ask about the search. They'd found nothing new, no sign of animals, no tire tracks except their own. I asked if they'd questioned the owner again. The deputy at the desk said Blandon had been cooperative, even let them search his other properties. I asked how many there were. The deputy glanced at his computer and said, 6 cabins total scattered across the county. I asked if any other guests had ever gone missing. He said no, not that they knew of. His voice faltered slightly on the last word. I spent the rest of the day driving the back roads that spidered out from Moss Hollow, stopping at gas stations, diners, anywhere someone might have seen a red Jeep or a couple traveling alone. Most folks shook their heads polite, but guarded. Small towns protect their own. At one diner, an older man refilling coffee leaned in close and said he remembered a pair matching that description came through about a year ago. Different faces, same story. City folks. Cabin stay. Never came back. He said it with the rhythm of gossip, but the look in his eyes was serious. I asked if he told the sheriff. He shrugged. Wasn't my business. That phrase stuck to me like burrs. Wasn't my business. I heard it again 2 days later from a ranger when I asked if the trails around Moss Hollow were regularly patrolled. Not much call for it, he said. Folks don't tend to stay long. The words carried more weight than I think he meant. By the end of that week, the official search scaled back. The sheriff said they'd keep the case open, but unless new evidence appeared, they'd have to assume the couple got lost or left the area voluntarily. The phrase voluntarily missing made something in me harden. I looked him dead in the eye and said my sister didn't just vanish. He nodded, but his eyes told me he'd already moved on to the next file. When I flew home, I carried the smell of that cabin in my clothes. It followed me off the plane into my apartment through every load of laundry. Nights stretched longer. I started waking at the same time, 3:14 a.m. Heart racing, convinced I'd heard that knock again, the one from the reports. 3 slow raps on a door that opened to nothing. I'd get up, check the lock, walk the apartment once, then sit by the window until dawn bled through. People stopped asking for updates. Friends meant well, but you can hear it in their voices when they've started to make peace with your loss for you. I went back to work, though. The hospital lights felt harsher now, the beeps sharper, every cry in the hallway a thread back to Harper. On my breaks, I'd scroll through message boards about missing persons, reading strangers' theories. Some said the woods had their own way of keeping what they wanted. Others whispered about drifters, survivalists, men who knew how to disappear, people without leaving a mark. In August, nearly a year later, I got an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a shot of the cabin from the tree-line evening light slanting across the porch. Nothing else. No message. No fingerprints I could see. I stared at it for hours before realizing the angle matched one of the photos Harper had sent the day they arrived. Whoever took it had stood in the same spot. That was the moment something in me shifted from waiting to acting. I booked the cabin under a different name, using an alias that wouldn't trace back to me. I told no one except one old friend from my trauma days, a former cop who still owed me a favor. I packed my bag, flashlight, gloves, recorder, a small revolver I hadn't touched in years. The drive back to Montana felt both familiar and foreign, as if I'd been looping around the same orbit and was finally falling toward it. When I turned onto Moss Hollow Trail again, the sun was going down, and the trees were exactly as I remembered, dark, tall, watching. The cabin stood waiting, clean, perfect, a replica of its own ghost. I killed the engine, listened to the quiet settle, and stepped out. The air smelled the same pine dirt and that faint trace of something chemical beneath. I walked up the porch steps, hand on the rail, and felt the wood still smooth from sanding. Inside, the silence was complete. No creak, no hum, no hint of time passing. I closed the door, locked it from the inside, and stood there a long moment, breathing. My voice sounded too loud when I spoke into the recorder, just a few words marking the date, the hour, my purpose. The same kind of statement you make before you start surgery. And as I walked deeper into that spotless room, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever had started here hadn't ended yet. The air inside that cabin held still, like the walls were waiting for me to speak first. I stood near the door, letting my eyes adjust to the half-light. Everything looked the same as before, neat, colorless, careful. I took a long breath through my nose. The cleaning solution was stronger now, mixed with a hint of damp wood. I set my duffel by the bed, pulled my recorder from my pocket, and spoke low. "Day 1, I said. Interior inspection beginning." My voice sounded foreign in that quiet, too sharp, too aware. The floor gave a small creak under my boots as I walked toward the fireplace. The sound felt almost indecent in the hush, like stepping into a church after service. I knelt by the hearth, ran my fingers along the edge of the stone, tracing the dark stains baked deep into the grout. Burn marks, not soot. Hair, maybe fabric. I couldn't tell yet. The smell was faint, but it reached somewhere old in me, the smell of something once alive. I swallowed and turned away. The bed came next. Crisp sheets, squared corners. Too precise for a rental, too careful. I got down on my knees and shined my small flashlight underneath. That's when I saw them, 4 thin gouges in the wood frame tight together just below the edge. I brushed my hand over them and felt the tiny splinters catch my skin. They were deep-angled, torn into the grain as if someone had clawed for air. I whispered into the recorder again, slower this time. Defensive marks. Left side. 1 person. Probably on the floor. I sat back and stared at them for a long minute. That's when the first crack in my voice came not from fear, but from the confirmation that she had fought. The day dragged. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, every drawer. The cupboards held canned goods arranged too neatly, like someone trying to prove they didn't care. Behind a row of peaches, I found a single glass rim, chipped faint stain inside the lip. I bagged it with the others. The clock on the wall ticked once every 3 seconds, too loud for the room. Time itself felt rehearsed here. Just after dusk, I heard it. 3 knocks, measured, steady, same rhythm from the report. I froze mid-step. The sound rolled through the cabin, low and hollow. The porch light flickered through the curtain. I moved to the door quiet as I could and looked through the peephole. Nothing but fog and pine. The night outside was the color of charcoal, thick enough to choke on. I opened the door halfway, the pistol in my right hand. "Hello?" I said, barely louder than breathing. Nothing answered, not even the insects. I stepped onto the porch and scanned the tree line. The fog drifted slow and heavy, curling around the posts like smoke. Then, through it, a shape began to form, tall, thin, leaning on one leg. It didn't move closer, just stood there. My finger tightened on the trigger, but before I could speak again, the shape turned and walked into the woods. The sound of its boots faded quick, as if the trees had swallowed it whole. I locked the door and sat on the floor against the wall, gun across my lap, recorder still running. My heart hadn't pounded like that since the hospital those nights when a patient would code and you had exactly 60 seconds to decide if someone lived. I forced my breathing to slow, counting the seconds. Then I rewound the tape, between the pops of the fire and my own breath. Another sound came through a faint whisper drawn out like a sigh. 2 syllables. Evie. My name. Not the alias I'd used to book the room, not even the one from the records. My name. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fireplace, flashlight balanced on my knee, waiting for morning. When light finally broke through the windows, it was gray and thin, as if the sun was reluctant to reach this far. I poured myself a cup of black coffee, but it tasted wrong, metallic. I dumped it and tried again, more for something to do than thirst. The quiet pressed down harder in daylight. I turned my focus to the floor near the back door. A faint line of scuff marks led from the threshold toward the hearth, like furniture had been moved, dragged, maybe something heavy. I followed the marks across the floor until they disappeared beneath a large bear-hide rug that looked too new for this place. I crouched down, pinched the edge of the hide, and pulled. A small square seam appeared subtle, but there. A trap door. I sat back on my heels and stared at it for a long while. My pulse slowed to a crawl. I should have waited, called Marcos, the only person who knew where I was. But curiosity and dread often wear the same mask, and I've always had trouble telling them apart. I lifted the handle. The hinges groaned. A dark mouth opened beneath me. The smell hit first mildew rot, and something sweeter underneath like wet copper. I switched on my flashlight and shined it down. A metal ladder led into a crawl space maybe 3 feet high, running the length of the cabin. The beam of light caught the glint of something pale at the far end. I climbed down 1 rung at a time, gun still in my right hand, flashlight in the left. The dirt floor was cold and uneven. My boots sank into soft patches where the soil had been turned. I followed the light along the wall ductwork above me, insulation drooping like old skin. The smell grew stronger the deeper I went. In the far corner, half buried in the dirt, a pile of objects sat like an offering. I crouched down, wiped the beam across it. A pair of women's boots, small, scuffed at the toes. A torn denim jacket. I reached out, brushed the collar clean. Faded thread-stitched initials, HW. My sister's jacket. My throat closed. I dug a little deeper, the soil damp under my nails, and touched bone. Smooth, narrow human. I don't remember climbing out. My memory skips like a damaged record. The next thing I knew, I was on the cabin floor again, shaking my hands coated in dirt. I remember thinking she didn't leave. She was left here. I sat for what could have been minutes or hours. Then the survival part of my mind kicked back in. I took photos, sealed what I could in evidence bags, wiped my prints from the trapdoor handle. I needed someone outside the county to hear this. Someone not under the sheriff's thumb. I called Marcos from the porch where the signal was strongest. He picked up on the third ring voice, groggy. Evelyn. What the hell? I spoke fast too fast, told him about the crawl space, the remains, the jacket, the smell. He swore under his breath and told me to stay put. He'd make some calls, get someone federal involved. The line cut out mid-sentence. I looked at the bars, 0. The woods had gone silent again. No birds, no wind. I went back inside, locked every bolt, and sat by the window. My eyes caught movement out near the tree line, a figure again, same as before, maybe closer. He was standing by a stump this time, still as a scarecrow. I could see the outline of overalls, maybe a flannel shirt, nothing else. I stayed there, gun on my lap, until dusk swallowed the shape. By the time night came, fog rolled in thick enough to touch. I killed the lights, sat in darkness except for the ember glow of the fire. My mind replayed every story I'd read in those missing persons databases, every photo of couples smiling by cabins they'd never leave. There was a pattern, every site remote, every owner tied to the same chain of shell companies. And at the top of that list was the name I'd seen too many times already, D. Blandon. I opened my laptop, found the file I'd saved offline, and clicked through each case. 6 couples in 7 years, 2 from Washington, 1 from Idaho, the rest scattered through Montana. All vanished near properties managed by him. I scrolled to the last entry, a couple in 2020, Stephen and Jordan Miles. The listing address for their cabin matched this same road. I sat there staring at the screen until a noise from below snapped me out of it. A dull metallic clang. Then another like a ladder rung shifting under weight. I turned toward the rug. It moved just slightly like a breath from underneath. I aimed the flashlight pulse, hammering so hard I could barely keep the beam steady. The rug went still. I stepped closer 1 inch at a time, then 3 knocks, not from the door this time, but from under the floor. Slow, deliberate. I backed away, gun raised, shaking so badly I could hardly see straight. The noise stopped as quickly as it started. I waited, counting to 60, to 100, to 200. Nothing. When the sun rose again, I hadn't slept. I didn't dare. I called Marcos again from the porch. This time, the call held long enough for him to say he'd reached a contact in Helena that a state investigator might come by within 48 hours. Don't go near that man, he said. Promise me Evie. I said I'd try. But even then, deep down, I knew promises made in fear are just words you hope won't turn into lies. By late morning, I decided to search behind the cabin where the ground dipped into the drainage. I wanted more proof, something they couldn't ignore. I moved slow, marking each spot that looked disturbed. About 20 feet from the back steps, my boot sank into soft soil. I crouched, scraped with my knife, and unearthed a small metal button, silver, engraved with a tiny bird. My heart stuttered. It matched one from Harper's jacket. I bagged it, tagged the spot, and stood there until the wind picked up enough to remind me the world still existed. When I came back inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell of fresh, stronger bleach mixed with something chemical. Someone had been in here while I was outside. I checked every room, every corner. Nothing missing, nothing added, just cleaner. I stood there, fists clenched, listening for any sound beyond my own breathing. Then a knock at the door. Not the 3 slow raps from before. This was heavier, confident. A man's voice followed, calm and neighborly. Miss Green. You in there, my alias. I didn't answer. This is Don Blandon, property owner. Just checking in. I edged toward the window and looked through the curtain. There he was, lean frame, sunburned skin, that same half smile from the photo. He wore work boots and a brown flannel sleeves rolled to the elbow. "Just wanted to make sure you got settled," he said. "Had some bears tearing through trash bins up on the ridge." I forced myself to open the door halfway. "I'm fine," I said, steady but low. His eyes flicked past me into the cabin, scanning. "Beautiful place, ain't it?" he said. "Peaceful, quiet." I nodded, hand tight on the edge of the door. He lingered a moment too long. "Be careful wandering," he added. "Fog rolls in fast. Had a couple up here last year, got themselves turned around, never came back." He said it like he was commenting on the weather. I asked if he'd known them. He smiled, small tight. "Just saw their picture in the papers." "Shame." Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "That perfume you wear, it's nice. Real familiar." I hadn't worn any perfume. Harper had. The blood drained from my face. He nodded once, turned to leave, and called over his shoulder, "Enjoy your stay, Miss Green." I watched him walk down the trail until the trees took him. Only then did I close the door locket and slide to the floor, shaking hard enough to drop the pistol. My mind was a blur of memory and rage, the two currents feeding each other until I could barely separate one from the other. He knew. Not just about me, but about her. I stayed by the fire the rest of the day, journal open, recorder still running. Outside, the fog thickened until the world beyond the porch disappeared. Every so often I thought I heard a branch crack or a footstep somewhere in it, but when I looked, there was only the shifting gray. Toward evening, I went to the pantry, needing to check the shelves again. I moved the cans one by one until I reached the back wall. Something caught my eye, a small wooden crate tucked behind the peaches. Inside were odds and ends, old batteries, rope duct tape, and a Polaroid face down. I turned it over. Harper stared back at me. Her eyes wide, her mouth open, mid-breath, fear written clear as daylight. Behind her, blurred but unmistakable, stood a figure wearing an antlered mask. My hand went numb. I pressed the photo to my chest and slid down to the floor. Every breath I took felt too loud. I don't know how long I sat there before I reached for the recorder again. My voice sounded strange, almost calm. "Found photograph," I said. "Harper in frame. Masked figure behind. Confirmed connection to property owner." I stopped staring at the flames. The truth had finally come up through the floorboards, and it had teeth. Outside, something moved on the porch again. This time there was no knock, just the sound of boots pacing slow back and forth, back and forth. I raised the gun finger light on the trigger and whispered to the dark, "I know who you are." The pacing stopped. Then came silence so thick it pressed against the windows. That was the moment I realized the line between the hunter and the hunted had just changed places. The fire had burned itself down to a low orange breath by the time I finally moved. The photo of Harper was still warm from my hands, edges soft where I'd held it too tight. Outside, the fog pressed against the glass like it wanted in. I stood, tucked the picture inside my coat pocket, and made myself walk toward the rug again. My fingers hovered over it. Beneath that thin layer of fur and dust, I could feel what waited. The kind of knowing that drags you forward even as your whole body begs to stop. I pulled it back, pried the trapdoor open, and let the flashlight cut a white slice through the dark below. The smell of decay rose to meet me, old, wet, and sweet, in a way that made my teeth ache. I went down the ladder, slow boots hitting the metal rungs with soft clinks that echoed longer than they should have. The air down there was heavy, the kind that doesn't circulate, just clings. I could see the edge of the space now, the same crawl area I'd glimpsed before, but deeper in the far corner was something new, a glint of metal. I crouched low, brushed away the dirt. It was a tin box, sealed with duct tape, edges rusted. I worked my knife under the lid and peeled it open. Inside were bundles of zip-tied hair, bits of jewelry, 2 wedding rings still linked together and a small black notebook, the cover worn smooth from use. I flipped it open, and there they were. Names, dates, pairs of initials. Harper and Ryan, 2022. Miles and Jordan, 2020. Page after page, 12 couples in total. At the bottom, written in fresh green ink, was one more. Rachel Green, 2023. My alias. I felt the air leave my lungs all at once. He'd known I was coming before I even arrived. The silence around me broke in small ways, the groan of the wood above the soft creak of settling dust. But it didn't sound like a house anymore. It sounded alive. I climbed out fast, my hands shaking so badly I almost slipped on the ladder. When I reached the floor, I shoved the rug back over the hatch and sat down against the wall. My pulse was hammering in my ears, but my thoughts were clear in that narrow way they get during triage. Call Marcos, record everything, stay alert. I dialed him again. The signal came through weak but steady this time. I found proof, I said. A journal names remains in the crawl space. He's a serial. Marcos swore, said he'd get someone from the bureau looped in, told me not to move until he called back. If the local cops are tied to him, you wait for my people. You hear me? I said yes, but even then I was scanning the windows. When the call dropped, I saw it, the shadow outside, standing where the fog thinned at the edge of the porch. Same height, same frame. Don. He didn't knock this time. He just lingered, pacing slow. I killed the lights and crouched low, heart climbing into my throat. His boots made a soft scrape on the boards, then silence. After what felt like hours, I heard him speak. Some people don't know when they're not welcome, he said. His voice was casual, like he was talking to a friend. I stayed still, barely breathing. I gave you a chance to leave. Then came the sound of footsteps moving off the porch and fading into the woods. I didn't move until I couldn't hear him anymore. By dawn, I decided waiting wasn't an option. I needed more evidence, something they couldn't bury. I took the journal, my recorder gloves, and went out the back door into the cold. The fog had thinned, leaving the air damp and metallic. I followed a narrow trail behind the cabin, one I hadn't noticed before. The path cut through a stretch of brush and down a small hill, the kind of track made by someone's repeated boots. After about 100 yards, the smell hit me. The same sweet, rancid rot that had filled the crawl space, but stronger, carried on the breeze. I rounded a patch of fallen pine and saw the clearing. The ground was lined with mounds, 8 of them, each neat rounded, covered with stones and pine needles. Crude wooden markers at their heads, numbers, carved in instead of names. I froze. The earth looked freshly turned at the far end. One grave half dug. A shovel leaned against a stump nearby, the handle streaked with something dark. I walked closer every step, careful, deliberate. In the loose soil of that half-dug hole, something caught the light. I reached down and brushed it clean, a wristwatch scratched but still ticking. The inscription on the back read, "To Ryan. Forever." My knees gave out before I could think. I sat there in the dirt, clutching it in my palm until my skin went numb. That's when I heard the twig snap behind me. I turned and saw him standing there, Don Blandon arms folded, dirt on his hands. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked amused. "You should have left," he said softly. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I fired once, the shot tearing through the silence. It missed, went wide. He lunged fast for a man his age. The impact knocked the breath clean out of me. We hit the ground hard. The gun flew from my hand and vanished into the brush. He pinned me, his forearm crushing my throat. "You shouldn't have come back," he hissed, spit hitting my face. My fingers scrambled at my hip until they found the handle of the knife. I swung it upward, felt it bury deep in his side. He roared, stumbled back, clutching the wound. Blood bloomed dark through his flannel. I crawled toward the pistol, grabbed it, raised it, but by the time I steadied my aim, he was gone, crashing through the trees, one hand pressed to his ribs. I didn't chase. I just sat there in the dirt, the world spinning around me, the watch still clenched in my other hand. I stayed until the shaking stopped. Then I dragged myself back up the hill, back to the cabin, and locked the door. My shoulder throbbed where he'd thrown me down. I could feel the bruises already forming along my throat. I knew it wasn't over. I started recording again, my voice raw. Confirmed graves behind property. Total of 8. 1 open, 1 personal item belonging to Ryan Walker recovered. Suspect wounded fled on foot. Saying it out loud steadied me. I called Marcos again, nothing but static. I checked the bars, 0 again. I tried to send a text. He's alive. Found burial site. It failed 3 times before disappearing altogether. I stood in the middle of that spotless room, realizing the truth that had been circling me for days. I wasn't trapped by distance or storm. I was trapped by design. I must have drifted because the next thing I remember is waking up in darkness, the fire long dead, the air colder than before. My head ached. Something soft brushed my face. When I opened my eyes, I was on my side on a concrete floor, wrists bound tight behind me. The air was damp, the walls stone. It took me a moment to understand where I was, the cellar I hadn't found before the one hidden beneath the cabin. A single bulb swung above weak light, casting long shadows. Then his voice came from the corner. Didn't want it to go this way. Don stepped into view, pale sweating, one hand taped over his side. My gun sat on the table beside him. "You really shouldn't drink the same perfume as your sister," he said almost gently. I spat blood, glared at him. "Why?" I asked. He sighed, pulled a chair over, sat down like we were just 2 people having a conversation. That's what they all ask. But it's never just one reason. People are complicated, Evie. Evil isn't lightning, it's a drip. Little drops over years until it soaks you through. His eyes drifted toward the wall, unfocused. "You think you're the first to come snooping?" "You're not." The others were easier to turn around. "But not you. You came in armed. That made you interesting." I flexed my hands behind me, testing the bindings. They were plastic tight, but brittle. He stood and moved toward a shelf, talking as he went. "You know your sister fought hard. Bit me right here." He pointed to his ear where a small scar twisted through the cartilage. "She broke a tooth, too. Most of them cry, not her. She screamed, but not for herself, for him." His smile twisted. "She made me improvise." I felt the nausea rise up my throat. I asked if he killed her alone. He paused. Then, almost casually, he said, "No. My brother helped. He liked it messy. I liked it clean." He glanced back at me, waiting for the question. "Your brother's dead," I said. He chuckled a dry sound. "People say a lot of things before they die." While he talked, my fingers found the edge of the knife sheath still taped to my jeans. The tape had loosened when he dragged me here. I worked the zipper open slow, praying the sound blended with the creak of the bulb chain above us. He poured himself a drink from a metal thermos vodka by the smell. "You loaded this gun with hollow points," he said, tapping my pistol on the table. "That's overkill. I respect that." He knelt beside me. "Any last words? Rachel Green?" I met his eyes. "Yeah," I said. "That's not my name." Then I drove the blade into his thigh. He screamed, stumbled backward. I rolled, slammed my shoulder against the table leg. The gun clattered to the floor. I kicked it away from him, scrambled to my knees. He lunged, grabbing for my hair, but I swung the broken stool leg beside me and caught him across the jaw. He fell, stunned, but not out. I grabbed the hammer off the nearby workbench, turned and swung until his body went still. The sound echoed in that stone room like a drumbeat, fading slower than it should have. I dropped the hammer and backed against the wall, chest heaving, the bindings still biting into my wrists. For a moment, the only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then footsteps above measured heavy. Not police, not help. Someone else. The cellar door creaked open at the top of the stairs, letting in a strip of yellow light. A man's silhouette filled it, tall, steady, not rushing. He stood there a moment before descending step by deliberate step. I pressed myself against the cold wall, heartbeat climbing again. The man's face came into view. Middle-aged, darker skin, sharp eyes. He wasn't holding a weapon, but everything about his posture was wrong. "Who are you?" I rasped. He looked at Don's body on the floor, then back at me. "Name's Ray Delane," he said. "I used to help Don. Keep watch, clean up after." He spoke at plain no shame, like he was reciting a job title. "He said you were trouble." I stared at him, searching for any sign of hesitation. "He said you were dead." Ray smiled, a small, tired curve of his mouth. "People say a lot of things before they die," he repeated. He crouched beside Don's body, nudged it with his boot, and shook his head. "Guess I'll be cleaning up one last mess." I shifted, testing the knife still in my hand, but he noticed. "You could run," he said quietly, "or you could stay and finish this. Either way, it ends here." His voice was calm, almost weary, and that scared me more than anger ever could. I held his gaze for a long moment, the room spinning between us, the air thick with iron and dust. Then I threw the hammer at him. He ducked the handle, grazing his temple, and I bolted up the stairs. My shoulder hit the door so hard it flew open, slamming into the wall. Cold air flooded in. I grabbed my duffel, the journal, Harper's watch, and ran. Behind me, Ray shouted something I couldn't make out, his voice echoing up through the floorboards. I didn't look back. The trees closed around me as I sprinted down the trail toward the main road, branches snapping at my face. By the time I saw the ranger tower, my lungs were on fire. I burst through the clearing, waving my arms, yelling until a ranger stepped out, startled. He saw the blood, the dirt, the gun in my hand, and went pale. "Call the FBI," I gasped. "Body's Moss Hollow. He's dead. Another one's coming." He grabbed his radio and started shouting into it. I collapsed onto the gravel, clutching the watch in my palm, whispering her name until the sirens finally cut through the mountains. The hours that followed came in flashes. Bright lights, voices, hands lifting me into a cruiser. Questions I could barely answer. They found 7 graves behind the cabin that day, 3 more beneath it, 1 under the concrete foundation. Harper and Ryan were buried side by side. I stood far enough away not to see the details, but close enough to feel the earth give when they lifted her out. Her arms were still wrapped around him. They said Don died in that cellar. Ray Delane disappeared into the woods before they could catch him. When I finally sat down across from the detective, I handed him the journal. "Start here," I told him. My voice didn't sound like mine anymore. It was hollow, scraped, raw. But it was steady. I knew this wasn't over. Ray was still out there, and somewhere in those dark hills, a man who called himself a helper was watching the road for me. The last time I saw Moss Hollow was from the back seat of a county cruiser, the sun cutting through the trees like it had been waiting for its chance. The cabin looked smaller in daylight, fragile, even its green roof catching the light in flashes through the branches. The sheriff's men stood in the clearing, their boots sinking into wet soil, yellow tape shifting in the wind like ribbons. I remember thinking how ordinary it looked. You could pass it on a Sunday drive and never know how much of hell had been buried underneath. They found Harper and Ryan together. The coroner said the soil had preserved them longer than it should have, the cold keeping the worst of time at bay. I didn't want to see their faces. I didn't need to. It was enough to know they'd been found, that the years of silence had finally broken open, that the ground had finally given them back. The agents told me it would take months for full identification, but I already knew. A sister knows, sometimes before anyone else does. After they finished pulling evidence from the crawl space, I sat in a plastic chair under a canopy wrapped in a blanket someone handed me. I could still smell the cabin on my clothes bleach and pine, a mixture that never leaves once it gets in your nose. One of the younger deputies, a boy no older than my nephew, brought me water and asked softly if I wanted to go to the hospital. I told him no. Hospitals are where things end. I'd spent enough years inside them to know that. I wanted air. I wanted distance. They questioned me for hours that night. I told them everything I could remember, which was a strange kind of torture, knowing your memory has turned into evidence that every word you speak might be replayed by strangers who weren't there. They asked me to describe Don's last moments, to talk about Ray Delane, to go through it again and again until I sounded like a recording. I answered until my throat felt raw. When it was over, one of the agents, Sawyer I think, set his pen down and said quietly, "You did what you had to." I nodded, but those words don't settle easy. Doing what you have to never feels like winning. Ray was gone by the time they swept the woods. They found footprints, blood droplets from where he'd been hit, a torn piece of flannel snagged on a fence line. After that, nothing. The dogs lost the scent at the river. Some believed he bled out in the forest and the animals took care of the rest. Others weren't so sure. I learned not to argue with either theory. Some things are better left uncertain even if they haunt you. For a long time, I carried a kind of numbness that looked like strength from the outside. Reporters called podcasts, reached out a few networks, tried to buy rights to the story. I turned them all down. I didn't want this to be something people watched over dinner. I wanted it to stay where it belonged, with the people who remembered the faces, not the headlines. I moved out of state a few months after the trial ended, after Don's name was carved into the files as deceased and the official word closed was stamped across the case. Closure is an administrative term, not a feeling. It's a checkbox, not peace. They asked me once, during a follow-up interview, what justice looked like to me. I couldn't find a good answer. The law had its ending. The papers had theirs. But for me, justice came quietly in pieces. It came when they returned Harper's wedding ring, cleaned and sealed in a small bag. It came when they gave me Ryan's watch, the one I'd found in the dirt, now ticking again after they replaced the battery. It came when I stood by their graves that autumn, the wind carrying the smell of cedar, and realized the earth was no longer hiding them. There were other families, too. The ones whose names filled that journal. They came from everywhere: Seattle, Boise, Helena, Denver. One by one, they arrived in Homestead County, clutching photos, each face carrying its own version of my grief. We stood together at the site where the cabin used to be after the county burned it down for evidence disposal. The flames caught fast, dry pine crackling like bones. The fire climbed into the night sky and turned the clearing orange. Some cried, some prayed, most just stared. I remember the way the heat felt against my face, clean, final, almost holy. The FBI kept me updated for a while after that. They found a storage locker in Idaho linked to the same shell company Don used for his properties. Inside were bags of clothing, camping gear, personal IDs belonging to couples who'd gone missing as far back as 2010. Each item cataloged, each name tagged. The total count stood at 12 confirmed victims, though they believed there were more. Every time a new name was matched, I felt both relief and heartbreak. Relief that someone else's wait was over. Heartbreak that it had to be this way. Marcos retired from law enforcement not long after. He said some cases leave too much residue, and this one had gotten under his skin. We still talk every now and then, usually in the quiet hours of the evening when sleep doesn't come easy. He tells me to stay cautious, that Ray might still be out there. I tell him I'm not afraid of shadows anymore. But sometimes, when a floorboard creaks or the wind knocks against the house just right, my hand still goes to the drawer where I keep my old service revolver. Habit more than fear. I kept the journal for a time locked in a safe deposit box. The Bureau wanted it for evidence, but I told them I'd hand it over when the last of the names had families again. It wasn't about ownership, it was about keeping their stories intact. Each page carried handwriting pressed so deep it left grooves on the next. You could run your finger over it and feel the weight of the lives taken. Eventually, when the investigations closed, I turned it in. They told me it would be archived at Quantico. I liked that idea. Let it sit somewhere sterile and well-lit where the dark can't reach it anymore. I've thought a lot about evil since then, not the kind you see in headlines, but the quiet sort that grows behind a smile. Don Blandon wasn't a monster in the way people imagine. He was polite, methodical, neighborly. The kind of man who'd stop to help you change a tire and ask about your family while he did it. That's what makes men like him so dangerous. They know how to blend in, how to speak softly enough to pass for normal. I used to think evil shouted. Now I know it whispers. In the 2 years since the cabin site has changed hands, the county sold the land to a wildlife conservancy. They planted saplings across the clearing, set up trail cameras, fenced the access road. You can't tell what it once was. Nature has its own way of reclaiming sin. Every spring, yellow wildflowers bloom where the cellar used to be. People drive by and see nothing but a stretch of forest coming back to life. That's fine by me. Some memories don't need monuments. I still dream of Harper sometimes. She's always standing in sunlight, the forest quiet behind her, her hair moving in the wind. She doesn't speak, just looks at me with that half smile she used to wear when she was about to tease me for worrying too much. I wake with her name on my lips, and for a few seconds I believe she's still alive somewhere. Then the day comes in steady and ordinary, and the world reminds me where I am. I've learned not to chase closure anymore. It's not something you arrive at. It's something you learn to carry. It's the space between remembering and moving on. I don't visit the grave often. Once a year, maybe twice. I bring one white rose and set it down without words. Sometimes I talk to her out loud, tell her what's changed, how Mom finally stopped keeping her room the same, how the house smells like coffee again. Other times, I just sit in silence and listen to the wind through the grass. It sounds almost like her laugh if you stay long enough. When people ask why I kept digging, why I didn't just let it go after all those years, I tell them the truth. It wasn't about revenge. It was about the light, about pulling something cruel out of the shadows so it couldn't touch anyone else again. The world doesn't always give us justice, but it gives us choices whether to look away or to keep looking. I chose to look, and in the end, that's what saved me. I don't live in Montana anymore. The winters are too long, the nights too quiet. I moved south near a lake where mornings are soft and the fog lifts by 9. The neighbors wave from their porches and sometimes I wave back. I've started taking photos again, mostly landscapes, mostly trees. I can't look at pine without remembering, but maybe that's the point. Memory doesn't have to be a wound. Sometimes it's a kind of compass pointing you toward what matters most. Last fall, I got a letter from one of the other families, the Mileses. It was short, written in neat handwriting. All it said was, "Thank you for not letting them stay lost." I kept that note on my fridge. Not as proof of anything grand, just as a reminder that small acts of persistence can still matter, even when they cost you more than you thought you had to give. Some nights I still hear knocking, faint and rhythmic, like the echo of something that refuses to fade. But I don't flinch anymore. I let it pass through the walls, through me until it's gone. The dead don't always ask for noise. Sometimes all they want is to be remembered in the quiet. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.